Coming up today on the Nick Craig Show, avoiding tough conversations. I've got a very interesting story from the West Coast. We'll get into all the details coming up. And a good Friday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Don't forget that you can take the show with you 24/7 on demand. It is a real simple, easy, and free to do so. Just search for the Nick Craig Show in your favorite podcast app or visit the website nickcraig.com. Our program this morning brought to you by Melissa Gott and the team over at the Law Group here in Wilmington. For any legal questions or challenges, lawgroupnc.com, or give them a call, 910-251-6088. We'll hear more from them coming up a little bit later on in the program this morning. It is typically a good format on talk radio and podcasts to give a little bit of background, a little bit of information on a story before you dive into the details. That's something for those that have been longtime listeners of the program are very familiar with. However, on the show today, I'm actually going to do things in the reverse order because the background as to how this came to light is only more interesting after you have the information that I'm about to pass along to you. So I've got a column here from an individual by the name of Matt Calkins, who is a sports columnist over at the Seattle Times. If you missed Monday's edition of the Nick Craig Show, I'd encourage you to head on over to your favorite podcast app, head on over to YouTube or Rumble or the website and check out Monday's show. We talked about the disaster that the WNBA is currently on a crash course for because they have this weird situation going on where they can't define what a woman is. There are two former NBA athletes in essentially trolling the WNBA have announced that they are going to make themselves draft eligible coming up in April of next year when the WNBA draft happens. And of course, it's putting all of these wacko leftist lunatics in a totally unwinnable situation, right? This is the party that doesn't want to define what a woman is, can't tell you what a woman is, believes that just because somebody wakes up one day, decides to put a dress on and pretends to be a woman, therefore they are a woman and everything is totally normal and totally sane, which of course the vast majority of the American people know is not. So a little bit of background, if you need it or want it, check out Monday's edition of the Nick Craig Show. So let's go through some of this column, and then there's a very interesting backside as to how this got published and where this got published. So again, this is by Matt Calkins, who is over at the Seattle Times. And the headline is this: agreeing with Sophie Cunningham's stance doesn't make you transphobic. A wild headline. The fact that even needs to be laid out, and this is not an indictment of Matt Calkins, the author of this piece, but just really more of an indication of where we are in society, where you have to state, hey, just because I don't agree that biological men, dudes that pretend to be women, should be eligible for female sports, it doesn't make you transphobic. It doesn't make you a bigot. So let's jump into this piece, and then I'll have some of the other details. He writes, some people saw bigotry, I saw bravery. I saw a teenage girl speaking up on an issue that so many adults shy away from. And by the way, this article was penned back a couple of weeks ago as this WNBA controversy has continued to roll out. So just keep that in mind. About 90 minutes before the Storm, referring to the Seattle Storm, played the Indiana Fever last Tuesday, 16-year-old Anna-Leigh Wilson stood at a rally outside of Climate Pledge Arena. Yes, that is literally the name of the venue where the Seattle Storm play. Climate Pledge Arena, wearing an XXXY athletic shirt while holding a sign reading, "Thank you, Sophie, for standing up for girls." It was a nod to the Fever guard, Sophie Cunningham, who has recently come out against trans females competing against biological ones. There were no slurs hurled, no malice detected. It was just Wilson, an Eastmont High School student, demonstrating what some have trouble accepting: that agreeing with Sophie Cunningham's position does not make you transphobic. Wilson, speaking to the author of this piece, said, and I quote, "I do not hate trans people and I have nothing against them. I just think that girls should have their own sports." This is a high school student. This is an actual high school female making these comments. I would say that in the realm of all political discussion going on, she is somebody that would be considered a subject matter expert, as she is, in fact, a female playing sports in high school. And so her comment, pretty clear. I don't hate trans people, but I also want to make sure that my sport is protected, that I have the ability to compete in a fair way. The author goes on saying, two things can be true at once. You can show compassion for people who feel trapped in the wrong body while acknowledging that they have a biological advantage. After all, why do we separate male and females in sports in the first place? It's not due to the potential awkwardness of physical contact. It's because men have higher testosterone levels and different skeletal and muscular frames, which together produce significant performance advantages. This isn't something I bring up at dinner parties, but it's undeniable. By every measurable metric in sports, whether it be the 100-meter times, vertical leaps, weightlifting, yards off a tee, etc., the top males substantially outperform the top females. So we're a little bit into this article, and everything that the author of this and Matt Calkins is saying is, I think, where the vast majority of people are. And I fall into this category as well. I don't particularly care what you do. I'm very much laissez-faire when it comes to what you want to do in your private life and how you want to express yourself to the rest of the world. I don't really care about it. However, there does become a period of time, there does become a point, and we're seeing this right now, where individuals feel that they can impede on other individuals' rights. They believe that they can impede on other individuals' opportunities because of how they feel. And that, for me, and I think many other people, is kind of where the buck stops with a lot of this. In short, the separation is strictly for the sake of girls and women. So surely one can see why too many allowing biological males to compete against females undermines this division. Wilson started speaking out after she finished second to a trans athlete in the mile at the Junior Olympics track meet 2 years ago. Before Tuesday's Seattle Storm game, she said that most of the in-person feedback she'd received had been positive and that the real vitriol was online. And this, kind of lays out the problem that the political left is dealing with right now. Here you've got a young high school or maybe middle school at the time, Junior Olympics. I don't know what age that falls into, but junior school, middle school or high school student, an actual girl, an actual female competing in sports at a very high level, finishing second to a dude pretending to be a woman. Most normal people in person say, God, that's awful. God, that's terrible. Like, what are we doing here? And of course, online, a bunch of keyboard warrior, mentally ill, demented Democrats and left-wing lunatics have decided that they're going to attack the actual female in this story because she doesn't think it's appropriate and isn't appreciative that a dude beat her in the Junior Olympics track meet back a couple of years ago. Well, that all changed a couple of hours later in the arena, where Wilson sat courtside with her "Thank You, Sophie" sign in hand. During the game, the Seattle Storm co-owner Celeste Keaton walked over to Wilson, allegedly calling her, quote, effing insane, but said the actual F word, adding, "I hope Jesus can forgive you," and supposedly brought her to tears. This happened after a fan pointed to another Sophie supporter and yelled, "Garbage, take that trash out." We talked about that on Monday's show as one of the co-owners of the Seattle Storm decided that it was her prerogative to verbally assault and abuse a paying customer. This really lays out another shining example of what's wrong with these people on the political left. As the co-owner of a WNBA team, which in large part up until just a couple of years ago nobody cared about, nobody went to, nobody watched, you would assume that you would try and get as many paying customers in the door as possible, because at the end of the day, sports are a business. But no, for Celeste Keaton, it was more important for her to push her out-of-control, wackadoo left-wing narrative on a young female in attendance at the game. That's the modern state of the Democratic Party. We are covering a column, an opinion op-ed by Matt Calkins, who works over at the Seattle Times. There's some interesting background as to how this got published. I'll get to that background once we finish the piece, doing things in a little bit of a reverse order here today on the program for a very good reason. And the whole purpose of the column is that agreeing with stances from individuals like Sophie Cunningham that it is important to protect female athletes, that it is important to protect female sports, does not make you a transphobe. It doesn't mean that your heart is filled with hatred on individuals. No, it means quite the contrary, that you want to make sure that the sport in which you want to participate in, the sport in which you work very hard to compete in, is protected. So he talked to a young female student at a local Seattle area high school who attended a Seattle Storm Indiana Fever game back a couple of weeks ago, where things got a little nasty, including one of the co-owners of the Seattle Storm and Celeste Keaton, a grown adult, a grown woman who decided to go up to this young teenage high school girl and call her effing insane for holding a sign that said, quote, "Thank you, Sophie." That's the state of the modern Democratic Party. Matt Calkins goes on in his piece saying, it's been a Category 5 hurricane, with Keaton receiving a 5-game suspension, J.K. Rowling, a very popular author in Cunningham, showing Wilson support on X, and pundits from every corner of the internet dissecting the scene. I guess myself included. I suppose I could make this about the WNBA, he writes, and its steady habit of garnering the wrong kind of attention. But I'd rather stick to the issue of who should be allowed to participate in women's sports. That is what Wilson comes to rally for, not intentional drama. One of the common counter-arguments against her and Cunningham's stance is that biological men in women's sports is rare, so why make it a fuss? The author goes on to write, okay, but if something is wrong, why should it matter how rare it is? Are opponents saying that if the amount of trans athletes reaches a certain number, then we should address it? To me, this is almost a tacit admission that there is indeed something unfair occurring. Plus, how rare is it? Trans swimmer Leah Thomas won the national title in the women's 500 meter while at Penn University. Trans cyclist Veronica Ivy set a world record in the 200 meter sprint for her age group. Trans weightlifter Lauren Hubbard won silver at the 2017 World Championship and in 2020 became the first openly trans person to compete in the Olympics. Here in Washington, referring to Washington State, not Washington, D.C., trans track athlete Veronica Garcia, representing East Valley High in the Spokane Valley, won the 2025 state title in the 400 meter. In Oregon, McDaniel High's Ada Gallagher won the 2025 state title in the 200 meter. In California, Jurupa Valley High School A.B. Hernandez won the 2025 state title in the high jump and triple jump. This doesn't mean that trans athletes have taken over women's sports completely, but the list goes beyond just the examples above. Another counter is that trans people are more vulnerable than most, and barring them from sports could be emotionally devastating. The author in Matt Calkins writes, I'm not unsympathetic to this. 2 points though. First, who's to say that biological girls wouldn't also feel distressed if displaced by a trans athlete or forced to share a locker room with a biological male? Second, and more importantly, this is about fairness, not feelings. The unfortunate truth with this is that someone is going to be disappointed. Either the biological female who feels that she's unreasonably disadvantaged or the trans athlete who can't participate. This debate is simply about who it should be. This is a very thoughtful piece, and I'll give you that as a little bit of a foreshadow of what's about to come. This is an individual in Matt Calkins who I specifically did not do any additional research on in terms of his political background, political identity. I read his pieces and I said, I'm going to stop here. There's no reason to dig into this person's background. This appears to be an individual working at the Seattle Times that is capable of discussing a conversation. The title of today's program, Avoiding the Conversation, is titled For That Way. It is important to have conversations. Not every single conversation is going to be pleasant. Not every single conversation is going to be filled with rainbows, unicorns, ice cream, and all the other fun things that we love in our modern society. Some things are complicated. Some things are tough. Some things are not always fun to talk about. But we as a society, we as adults in the room, I would argue, have the not only the ability, but should have the authority to have these conversations. And it's important that we do. Avoiding these kinds of conversations, like trans individuals participating in female sports, is something that needs to be discussed. And the previous paragraph that I just read from Matt Calkins does a perfect job at describing this. Right? Somebody is not going to feel right about this situation. And so the question is, who should it be? Should it be the biological females who have always had the right to participate in these sports? Or should it be the dudes, the biological men that have decided that they want to become women? Somebody is going to feel unjust. Somebody is going to feel that what they're trying to do is being met with a significant roadblock or a significant disadvantage. From my vantage point, and I think the vast majority of the American people, the answer is pretty clear. If somebody's going to be disadvantaged, it should be the biological male that is pretending to be a woman. Because the idea here that women across the entirety of not only the United States, but the world should have to lay down so a dude can pretend to be a woman and participate in sports is totally nuts. It's totally insane. Back to the piece. He writes, come November, Washingtonians can vote on an initiative that, if passed, would preclude biological males from competing against females in school sports. And though one might think this will increase open dialogue on the matter, we all know that this is one of the more frightening topics to suggest. Even if polling suggests that most of the country sides with Cunningham and Wilson, which, by the way, it does. We talked about that on Monday. Nobody wants to be called a bigot or a transphobe. Such attacks are what Tumwater High School student Frances Staudent says she endures every day at school. 2 Marches ago, she refused to play basketball against a biological male from an area school for fear of being injured. She added that the biological male's presence in the locker room made her feel uncomfortable. That hasn't spawned much sympathy from certain peers. And again, back to the question. Somebody is not going to get what they want here. Somebody is going to feel unjust. Who should it be? Should it be actual females or trans athletes, trans females? That is the $1 million question. This is, as I noted, a very well written, a very thorough piece from Matt Calkins, and that's why the second half of this story is so crazy. I'll wrap up his op-ed on this, plus some of the background that I didn't give you at the beginning, coming up here in just a couple of minutes. But before that, I want to tell you about the Law Group here in Wilmington and remind you not only would our show not be possible each and every weekday morning here without the team, Melissa Gott and her team over at the Law Group, but also remind you that when legal challenges arise, and at some point in life they will, make sure you put your trust in the Law Group right here in Wilmington. Since 2003, their experienced attorneys have consistently provided high-quality, affordable legal services across Eastern North Carolina. Whether you're facing a divorce, navigating a real estate transaction, or maybe you're in a position where you need a strong criminal defense, no matter the issue, the Law Group has your back. Their dedicated team ensures your questions are answered and issues are resolved as quickly as possible. Great news, folks. They're not some big national law firm. Melissa and her team live right here in southeastern North Carolina, and they're just a phone call away at 910-251-6088, or you can visit them online at lawgroupnc.com. That's 910-251-6088, or online lawgroupnc.com. It's the Law Group. Experience and dedication you can rely on. We appreciate the Law Group and their continued financial support here of the Nick Craig Show. All right, quick break. We'll get into more of this coming up as the Nick Craig Show continues on this Friday morning, streaming live, YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts. And a good Friday to you. Welcome back to the Nick Craig Show. Don't forget, if you miss any portion of our program, you can check out the show, the Nick Craig Show, in your favorite podcast app. Just search for it, tap the subscribe or follow button. You'll get a new program delivered each and every weekday morning. All the links, all the other information over on the website, nickcraig.com. We are covering a very thoughtful, very thorough opinion op-ed by Matt Calkins that was published. He writes, or he's a columnist, sports columnist for the Seattle Times, discussing what I thought was an issue that frankly had already been settled. This idea that it is appropriate for biological men to participate in female sports. I thought we went through this back a couple of years ago, but for whatever reason, it seems like some are willing to die on this hill of a very unpopular issue. This is in the political space, what we would call an 80-20 issue. 80% of people believe that it is totally insane and totally inappropriate for biological men to participate in female sports. 20% thinks that's totally normal. 20% thinks, yeah, this is the way forward. This is the path that we need to chart. Allow that to take place. So we're covering this column as he describes a scene in which he saw unfold out in Washington State back just a couple of weeks ago, as the WNBA has decided to dip its foot into this controversy because the idiot commissioner of the WNBA and the moronic leadership of that organization is now going to be forced by two former NBA players who have decided to declare themselves eligible for the WNBA draft coming up in April of next year to decide once and for all whether biological men pretending to be women are actually women or not. So I want to round out his op-ed here and then transition over into some of the background as to how we got to this point. So he's talking about two different young female athletes in this story. The one that we were just talking about before the break is a student by the name of Frances Student, who 2 Marches ago refused to play basketball against a biological male from an area high school because she didn't want to compete with the biological male and feared that she was going to be injured. She also added on top of that being in the locker room, no surprise here, being in a woman's or a female locker room with a dude in there also made her feel uncomfortable, but surprise, surprise, that's not a big problem. She told the author in Matt Calkins, quote, I have people at my school cussing me out. I have people using some pretty awful words towards me as well. I've had people say, F you, I hope you choke and die, but I know ultimately I'm doing the right thing. This whole thing isn't about hate. When asked, so this isn't an anti-trans movement, the, again, young, actual female athlete responded by saying, there's so many ties that I can say that what we are standing up for is not anti-trans. This is pro-women's sports. This doesn't mean that there aren't bigoted or transphobic supporters of this position. But what if we withheld these labels until absolutely sure? Most people, I think, want to do what is right. They just have a different opinion on what right is. We saw this at Tuesday's rally, which included protesters who came to denounce the pro-Cunningham event. In one of their hands was a sign that read, "No hate in WA State," referring to Washington State. It was supposed to be a shot at the Sophie supporters, but I don't think it landed. Something tells me that Anna Lee Wilson saw that and thought, I couldn't agree more. So this is a piece, as I mentioned, that was written by Matt Calkins, who was a sports columnist at the Seattle Times. That entire story that we just walked through over the last 30 minutes or so was written by him, given to his editor, for those that have not been in and around the newspaper space before. An author, in this case a columnist, writes something, it's given to an editor, they may make a couple of tweaks or changes, and then it is traditionally published. Well, in this case, this piece was not published. What I will describe as very thorough, very thoughtful discussion on what is going on in this blossoming issue of trans athletes competing in sports was a bridge too far and too controversial for the Seattle Times. Going once again back to the episode title, avoiding the conversation. The left is at a position right now, I think, in large part due to the unpopularity of the side of this issue that they're on, that they have decided in some cases that they just will avoid the conversation, bury their head in the sand, and hope that the problem just goes away. And as we have seen in years past, we know that that's not a good solution. We know that that will not lead to any sort of proper conclusion to what I believe is a major discussion that is taking place right now. Because of the Seattle Times' unwillingness to publish this article, because the Seattle Times wanted to avoid this conversation and didn't want to, of course, get wrapped up in the firestorm that would be created in large part by those on the political left for allowing such a transphobic bigot in Matt Calkins to write this article, which seemingly just looks at both sides and says, hey, there's issues over here, hey, there's issues over there. Because the Seattle Times didn't want to dip its foot into that issue, they decided not to publish it. And in response, the piece that we just read was published independently by Matt Calkins, who decided this week that he was going to resign after 11 years as a sports columnist at the Seattle Times. He published this on his own personal Substack and then followed up with this story. I was a sports columnist at the Seattle Times for 11 years. This is why I resigned. He writes, I really wanted the column to run. I didn't think it would, but I felt obligated to try and get it in. Towards the end of last month, before the Seattle Storm hosted the Indiana Fever, I spoke to people attending a rally in support of Sophie Cunningham outside of Climate Pledge Arena. The Fever Guard had recently taken a stance against biological males competing in women's or girls' sports, and a few dozen folks showed up to express their gratitude for her position. One of them was 16-year-old Annalie Wilson, who'd lost to a biological male in a track and field race in 8th grade and was holding a sign reading, "Thank you, Sophie, for speaking up for girls." I didn't know if I was going to write something at that point, but after she allegedly got cussed out by Seattle Storm co-owner during the game, I felt like I had to weigh in. One thing that Wilson emphasized to me at the rally was that she wasn't anti-trans. Another student athlete named Frances Student who also said she had endured daily verbal abuse after refusing to play against a biological boy in a basketball game, echoed Wilson's statement. So that was the thesis of my column, which you can read here. I'll have the link to this over in the show notes, that supporting the separation of biological females and males doesn't automatically make you transphobic. So let's stop throwing those labels around. I sent a draft after talking to my editor the morning of Friday, July the 31st, telling him that there was no rush to run it. He told me later that day that he and others were looking at it, but it wouldn't be ready for Sunday's paper. Monday night, I got an email saying that his boss was hoping to talk to the top 2 newsroom editors on it about Wednesday. No feedback had been given to me. Thursday afternoon, my editor informed me that it wasn't going to run because I didn't tell him I was doing this in advance. I didn't buy this reasoning. If that were the case, this piece would have been killed on the spot, not passed through the hands of multiple editors over several days. My response: to resign on the spot. Wow. Talk about really kind of going to the mat on this issue. So you've got a columnist who he even admitted in this Substack that he penned after he resigned. He went to the event to see if anything would happen, and that's a pretty common thing in journalism. You go to an event, you see if anything materializes. If it does, you write on it. If not, maybe you wasted a little bit of time, but so be it. That's kind of the name of the game. So he goes to the Seattle Storm game back in late July, sees the outdoor event. He says there's not that many people there. Takes down some notes, conducts a couple of interviews. It's not until the Seattle Storm co-owner decides to verbally assault one of the women one of the young female athletes that he had spoken to, that he decides, okay, there's something here, and I'm going to write on this, only for the Seattle Times to punt the story because they want to avoid the conversation. They want to avoid any sort of potential blowback for covering such a controversial issue like men in women's sports. We are rounding out what has been a very interesting couple of weeks for an individual by the name of Matt Calkins. He spent 11 years as a sport columnist at the Seattle Times out in Washington State. Did a very thorough job covering some of the current controversies as it relates to the WNBA, as they seemingly cannot decide and determine what a female is, putting that entity and organization in a very interesting position for them to deal with in the months to come. He went to a Seattle Storm Indiana Fever game back in late July to cover some of the recent controversy. This was just days after Sophie Cunningham, who plays for the Indiana Fever, was on ESPN saying, yeah, I think it's a little screwed up, and I don't think that biological men should participate in female sports. A very common stance, a very common take, an 80-20 issue, something that the vast majority of the American people agree with. Sophie Cunningham is, in fact, a professional female athlete. So in this case, you would call her a subject matter expert on the situation as somebody who has competed in the top echelon of female sports and understands a thing or two about what she's talking about. So Matt Calkins writes this story that I read earlier in the show. If you missed any of that, make sure you check out the podcast. And for that, his bosses over at the Seattle Times say, actually, we're not going to run this piece. The argument and the excuse they gave him, something I'm very familiar with when people that you work for don't like what you're doing, they decided to tell him that they weren't going to run the story because he didn't give them a heads up in advance. That's, of course, a completely nonsensical reason for not running a story. And so after more than a week of submitting this piece, that was the excuse. His response to that, he decided to resign on the spot. Back to his Substack that he published this week describing this situation. He writes, that may come off as an emotional decision, but it was exactly what I was prepared to do. This, after all, was one of several columns of mine that have been spiked at the Seattle Times. One was a piece questioning whether players for the U.S. women's soccer team were really the victims of discrimination in their equal pay lawsuit. Another was a more general column on cancel culture in sports. The last, written shortly after George Floyd's death, implored people to listen to the state championship basketball coach Mike Betha, a black man urging the public not to stereotype cops. The common theme here: all of these challenged privileged newsroom narratives and likely would have triggered the outrage mob. He goes on to say, I've always thought that it was a columnist's duty to generate discussion on the most hot-button issues. To avoid such topics was to leave the reader shortchanged. I guess in the end, I just didn't feel like I could do my job properly anymore. Right now, I'm in the position of trying to defend my resignation without sounding like a malcontent. So let me say this. I am very grateful for the 11 years I had at the Seattle Times. The talent there is immense, and the editors let me have a lot of fun with other stories. I also realize where the brass is coming from. The mob is frightening and does not forget. He's, of course, referring to the left-wing mob here. Lots of seemingly brave souls have submitted once activists have got their hooks in them. And if I had had more people depending on me, perhaps I'd act similarly. But in thinking about this decision, I kept going back to the Albus Dumbledore line. We must all face this choice between what is right and what is easy. To be honest, I'm scared right now. I have no idea how the next few months or years are going to play out, but the fear beats the indignity of being muzzled. The plan for now is to keep writing in this space. Maybe that will spawn a new career, or maybe I'll be a dental assistant in 2 years. I genuinely don't know. All that's certain is that I'm done holding back. The best things in life are free, speech being at the top of that list. This is a remarkable situation from Matt Calkins. I mentioned a little bit earlier in the program, I didn't do any research on the political background, and I'm not even sure if it's available, any of the political makeup. I did nothing in terms of research on Matt Calkins intentionally for this discussion and conversation because it's not relevant. He, as a sports columnist, an employee of the Seattle Times, saw a major sporting issue take place in his town. He was covering a Seattle WNBA game, literally in his backyard. One that garnered significant national attention after one of the co-owners of the Seattle Storm decided that she was going to verbally harass and assault a young female patron at the game. So this, to me, would fall under the category of a perfect story. Something that has gained national attention, something in which this columnist in Matt Calkins has firsthand knowledge as he had interviewed the same individual who hours later would be harassed by one of the co-owners of the Seattle Storm. By any sort of journalistic measure, this was the perfect kind of story. And it's got nothing to do with politics. It's got nothing to even do with the issue here of trans athletes. It's got everything to do with a local story, something that has garnered significant national attention, and a growing issue that is going on. You are the first-hand source. You are literally the boots on the ground. You are the Seattle Times after all. But as he writes in his Substack, and I think very accurately depicts, the Seattle Times and the cowardice leadership there was so afraid that if they ran this column simply laying out the two different sides of this argument, which we just read through, I thought it was a very thorough, thoughtful piece. If they had run that, the left-wing mob would have come with their pitchforks ready to burn down the Seattle Times, would have been calling for the heads of Matt Calkins and anybody else, the editor, anybody involved in allowing the publication of this piece, because that's how the left-wing mob operates. It's seek, search, and destroy. That's what they do. It's consistent. It's all the time. And because so many in the media landscape are so afraid to put their foot down, they're afraid with what a bunch of mentally ill lunatics on the political left are going to do, they shut people down. And in this case, they did not allow Matt Calkins to publish his very well-written piece. You couldn't claim, oh, this was just some garbage piece put together. No real thought went into this. This was a sloppy job. No, we just read through it. I just read every single word of it. It was a very thoughtful piece. It was very well written. From my vantage point, I do a decent amount of writing each and every month. It was a good piece. Now, they didn't agree with the political angle, of which there really wasn't any in it, but because they didn't agree with it and they are so afraid of the left-wing mob, they decided to spike the piece. And for that, Matt Calkins said, all right, then obviously there's no place for me here anymore, and decided that he was going to resign, and did in fact resign from his position after 11 years writing for the Seattle Times. Bravo to Matt. Bravo to standing up for what you believe. And the craziest part, he doesn't even really take that crazy of a stance in his opinion piece. Again, I don't know anything about this guy's political background. He might be a liberal Democrat for all we know. I have no idea. He was just covering a story and trying to shine a light on the controversy. And that was just a bridge too far for the Seattle Times. That was just a bridge too far for these out of control, deranged leftist lunatics that pretend that they are the media establishment here in the United States. I'm going to throw links to Matt's X account so that you can go and follow him. He's at Matt_Calkins, Calkins. I'll throw a link to both of his Substack pieces as well, and some other coverage of this, as he decided this week it was time for him to take a step away from the Seattle Times because they wanted to avoid a very important conversation. Shout out, bravo to Matt. Make sure you give him a follow over on X, and hopefully he lands somewhere in a publication, some sort of sports outlet that will allow him to, discuss important, relevant issues as it relates to sports. The WNBA is getting nearly daily coverage because of the stupid stuff that they're doing. You've got a guy covering this stuff here, and they decide that they're going to spike the story. So we'll see. I've made sure to follow Matt. We'll see where he lands and see if any other information comes to light from him. We'll keep you up to date with the details right here on the Nick Craig Show. All right, that's going to do it for a Friday edition. Thanks to the Law Group here at Wilmington for their continued support. Give them a call at 910-251-6088 or online at lawgroupnc.com. The Nick Craig Show streams live weekday mornings, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, available 24/7 in your favorite podcast app, and is heard weeknights, 9 to 10 p.m. on WBT Radio in Charlotte. Enjoy your weekend. We will do it again Monday morning right here on The Nick Craig Show.